Is this thing on yet?
Ought people to privilege some positions over others? It is important to note how this question relates to the questions of privilege as they are within the common discourse at this point, and how they relate to the more uncommon discourses. In the common discourses there are a variety of privileges that are predicated upon such things as race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. Hence, when we say that there is a privilege in a given culture predicated upon one's skin color, tacitly we are assuming, not wrongly imho, that there is something wrong with granting privileges predicated upon skin color. Likewise for gender, class, etc. In these cases we are explicitly holding that there is some other ethical concern involved with the situation aside from the mereness of privilege as such. That is, we are not generally holding that there is something necessarily wrong with privileging as such, rather we are holding that there is something wrong with privileging predicated upon certain characteristics, e.g. race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. In some sense we may posit that those are the wrong sorts of cases whereby we ought to be privileging. They are, in some meaningful sense these days at any rate, not controversial sorts of cases whereby we would hold that privileging is wrong. Moreover, we would tend to hold that the reason and rationale for holding such a position is, roughly, that folks ought to be treated equally, or at any rate, as equally as is plausible to do. Hence, when we say that racism bad, we are tacitly or explicitly holding that it is bad because folks ought to be treated equally, and hence that privileging of someone's predicated upon skin color, their race, is a bad sort of thing. Folks in the current are likely to say duh, but it is critically important to note that for the human species this is not a duh. That is, for the overwhelming majority of the species' existence racism, sexism, classism, bigotry in general has been a norm of behavior, and there are plenty of instances wherein this remains the case in the current. There are other less obvious sorts of questions regarding privileging that are by far more under scrutiny here. Privileging that is done predicated specifically upon scientism, factualism, broad cultural dispositions, and interpretations. These are the sorts of privileging that are not in the common discourse, or insofar as they may be, are by far the more controversial instances of privileging. Consider the flat earthers. Let's pretend for the moment that they are objectively or factually wrong in their assertion that the earth is flat. Of course these days, in most circles, this is an uncontroversial position. It is easy these days to privilege the view that the world is not flat, that it is roundish. I say roundish rather than round because of course the earth, and few celestial bodies for that matter, are anything approaching round in any precise sense of that word at any rate. Sphericalish is likewise perhaps a more accurate term, but imho that is somewhat besides the point, so roundish will be sufficient for this piece. We may for that matter dub the flat earthers as flattish earthers. The question therein though, is ought we to privilege the roundish earther view? For that matter, ought we to privilege either view, any view at all? What we mean by privileging are such things as, ought we to teach that the earth is roundish? Ought we to give equal, or perhaps proportional representation to the flattish earth view? Ought we to ridicule the flattish earthers? Ought we to make every effort we can to correct the flattish earthers on their view? This sort of question broadly relates to the questions of racism, sexism, bigotry, etc., in rather surprising ways, many of which will be explicated if not explained and explored within this piece. For here, we note only the broadest and relevant of strokes, they relate strongly to the questions surrounding colonialism. The privileging of one cultural view over another. To where, to whom if anyone at all, ought we or anyone at all to apply the knife? There are a few types of colonialism, and here I shall likely be departing from the current narrativized view and definitional concerns. Looking it up isn't going to be sufficient, little ones. These are discourses, communications, differentiations, dissectations, and philosophical ruminations. The answers are in the musings. It is best for the reader to have in mind the concept of two or more distinctive cultures, whereby those distinctions take on a variety of forms. The details of those distinctions are somewhat surprisingly irrelevant, as details oft are, but to give the reader a sense, differing cultures historically have been understood as defined by such things as types of tools used, shared stories, linguistic norms, styles of clothing, mating rituals, religious rituals, body type, read that as roughly skin color, e.g. racism, and perhaps most pertinently for this piece, such things as modalities of understanding and living within the world. The distinctions can be vague, trivial, overlapping, and so forth, such that two distinctive cultures may differ primarily on but a few axes and yet be considered distinctive. For instance, many of the religious distinctions between existing sects of a given religion may differ only by some small interpretations of the same sacred texts, or slight variations in the modality by which the faith is practiced. The distinctions can be non-vague, non-trivial, and hardly overlapping, such as non-adjacent cultures separated for millennia who come to meet for the first time, which of course was the case primarily throughout most of human history, for most cultures. And perhaps more pertinently, is what is happening currently globally via the internets. Such as perhaps merely tonal, something that sets the stage, the mood, the emotive state and the poetic discourse that lay within the piece, such may lack an embedment within the lyrical words, in other words. Still, the poetical deserves its due, gray or blue, and don't second-guess your feelings, you were right from the start. For this piece, we shall understand colonialism as the processes whereby otherwise distinctive cultures come to overlap. Classically, that is, historically, this has entailed that one or both cultures tends towards an ending, though not necessarily in the sense of the people dying off. Rather, in the sense that the various characteristics of one culture are no longer practiced, often in favor of some characteristic of another culture. Sometimes, simply ending is a matter of course, that is, ending simply in virtue of the fact that there is overlappingness, rather than anything particularly nefarious or even cognizantly chosen on the part of anyone involved. Typically these latter aspects, perhaps nominally the least ethically problematic sorts, amount to the generation of some new cultural expression through the synthesis of the constituent cultures. Call such the privileging of one view over another, whereby such privileging ought not be mistaken for always a good or a bad thing. Indeed, that kind of question is something of the ethical thrust of this piece. The modality of colonialism actually matters, as do its consequences, in terms of understanding the ethicities of colonialism. To quote the poets as if dreaming of colonialistic history, like a scene from a movie that every broken heart knows, we were walking on moonlight. Broadly speaking, when talking about colonialism, there are but a few types of it: technological, narrative, political, land-based, and bodily murderous. This list may, possibly, be expanded upon or contracted via simplification. These have a variety of ethicities to them. That is, their ethical valuation varies. It is not particularly difficult to grasp that the bodily murderous methodologies are ethically dubious, to put it lightly. Colonialism whereby stabbing other people's bodies to death is the modality is not an ethically sound methodology. Interestingly enough, aside from actual genocide, this methodology is also the least effective at colonialistic practices. That is, historically and as a matter of basic reason, unless one group is actually genociding another group, the colonized group retains its broad cultural structure, and historically actual genocides are rare, when considered as a relation to the number of cultural interactions, or as compared to wars, where effective is understood as the overcoming of a culture. We may also note that in some meaningful sense, such doesn't do well as a colonialistic modeling, as rather than cultural exchange, there is merely the destruction of one culture. Land-based colonialism is far more culturally destructive than bodily murderous, and yet in some sense far less ethically invalid, at least on a casual look. By land-based colonialism, I mean colonialistic practices whereby some other group of people move and live within the land base of a different group of people. This is far more destructive to existing cultures, in that they are effectively forced to interact intimately with the other group. By intimate I mean friendly, sexually, neighborly, and so forth. Due to living in close proximity to each other, land-based colonialism often entails all the other aspects of colonialism to varying degrees. With appropriateness to the topic at hand, in the middle and aftermath of a global genocide, the song as a whole, but then to this, hey, what can you say, we were overdue. But it'll be over soon. You wait. But then, I can't really, play the guitar very well, or, sing, so, you know, apologies. Something wise men say. Land-based colonialisms are plausibly more ethically sound in the exact same way as immigrants are ethically sound, and in the exact same way that a right to life is ethically sound. This despite the fact that they are almost certainly more destructive to the pre-existing cultures of that land base, and indeed, to all cultures involved in the process. Through living together, or nearby each other, they share their respective stories, technologies, lovers, families, political concerns, clothing, religious practices, etc. They also share their wars, murderous traits, and practice those against each other, whereas before they used to practice such things among themselves. Land-based colonialism becomes less ethically sound when the cultural practices are too heavily weighted in favor towards one particular culture, or set of cultures. Or more pointedly, when one culture is too underprivileged, or oppressed, or when one or more cultures dominate over the others. Such amounts to much of the issues spoken of regarding colonialism in the common discourse, so I won't bother expanding on them much here. Finally, on the point of land-based colonialism, it is important to note the removal of one group by another group of people is also a version of land-based colonialism, at least as it is classically and historically understood. In this case, we are understanding colonialism as not including the interactions of differing groups in any long-term sense. Hence, for the purposes of this piece, we are merely noting this kind of colonialism, but also not spending a great deal of time on its consideration. This kind of land-based colonialism takes a strong form of genocidal colonialism, and to be clear, it is a kind of colonialism whose ethicity is as dubious as the bodily murderous. In many cases, this style of land-based colonialism actually amounts to the bodily murder of masses of people. In general, in this piece, that kind of land-based colonialism is not what is primarily under consideration when the term land-based colonialism is being used, though it does have some significant parallels in the discussion regarding flattish earthers and modalities/ethicities of genocidal tendencies. I leave that largely to the gentle reader to suss out those differentiations as they become relevant. Political colonialism is broadly caught up in economics and military force, and the whole thing is rather obtuse and silly. Yet, insofar as it goes, the notion is that one or more cultures are dominating another culture or set of cultures in the sense that they rule the other cultures. The whole thing is generally rather silly in that by and large this kind of rulership doesn't actually do much in terms of destroying the other cultures. For the most part, that is, the cultural practices of the oppressed cultures can persist, with perhaps the limit being insofar as the oppressed cultural practices are not defining themselves via political rulership. In other words, unless a culture is all wrapped up in a flag of rulership, kings and queens, modalities of political decision-making, and so forth, the actual styles of dress, religious practices, food choices, and so forth all may remain intact. A culture that is hyper-patriotic such that its styles, dress, modality of living, etc., are caught up exactly in the politics, those sorts of cultures may actually suffer from a change in political leadership. In the current times, folks ought just note the degree whereby a lot of people are caught up in the politics of left and right and define themselves via their political leaning, and the degree whereby they suffer whenever there is a change in political leadership, even though of course in terms of what we typically refer to culture as, nothing has really changed for them. Worse still, such folks oft take the suffering from political differences to the point of thereby committing themselves to bodily murderous acts. Folks ought to understand such as a fairly common, overly common, trite, trivial, and trivially unimportant sort of colonialism. Its triviality making it unimportant in the sense of worthwhileness to consider in anything even approaching an intellectual, wisdom-based sense of colonialism as is being done here. Though, its triteness presents itself as of significant importance to the day-to-day lives of people. The point being that they do it to themselves, and the whole endeavor is rather silly. There are numerous examples of this kind of colonialism throughout human history, and in most, perhaps all cases, the change of the figurehead didn't really do anything meaningful to the cultural practices of the people involved. Of course it is also the case that for many, perhaps most people, this is among the most abhorrent kinds of colonialism, because after all, they want political power. Their concern, in other words, isn't so much about the issues of colonialism as it is with who has the rights to rule. Perhaps the most relevant instances of this kind of lesson regarding colonialism is that of the history of the Jewish people and the reality of the Roman Empire. For the former, despite not having a land base, and not having any meaningful political leadership throughout the majority of their existence, nonetheless have maintained their cultural practices. Some may even say they have maintained them better because of it, but that goes a bit beyond the scope of this piece on colonialism and privilege. For the latter, the general practice of provincialism whereby all regions subjugated by Rome, that is, by the actual center of political power, nonetheless maintained their cultural dispositions, their religious practices, their agricultural practices, and so forth. In short, they maintained all their cultural practices, save these, they paid taxes to Rome, and owed bended knee to their. A kind of flip side or inversion of the Jewish experience, perhaps not entirely coincidentally nor perfectly so though. Narrative colonialism is the practice of supplanting the various stories a culture tends to tell in favor of some other kind of story. Oft this takes the form of religious narratives, religious fighting, and nationalistic or politically narrativized practices. However, scientific, philosophical, and feministic colonialism are real sorts of things. Likewise, a variety of narratives surrounding, say, proper economics, modalities of trade, etc., amount to similar sorts of colonialistic practices. Perhaps most innocuously, such practices as education, novels, writings of most sorts, can and really ought to be understood as similar kinds of colonialism. In the context of the poets, such things may muse to be as to just give one thing to hold on to believe in this livin', is just a hard way to go. To make an angel. Would that muse make such things as now I understand, what you tried to say to me, and how you suffered for your sanity, how you tried to set them free, they would not listen, they did not know how, perhaps they'll listen now. But then, perhaps that muse is a bit much in the hyperbole. We shall see, we shall see. In the relevant sense of colonialism, this is among the more plausibly ethical modalities of colonialism, in the sense that the harms involved amount to a sharing of different stories. Yet, it is also among the most destructive in terms of cultures, in that there is a meaningful sense in which the stories a culture tells about itself do a lot of the work in defining themselves as who and what they are, how they interface with the world, and so forth. In the current, it is worth noting the degree whereby scientific colonialism is a thing, with its rather explicit attempts at destroying existing cultures as being little more or less than superstitious beliefs, or in its worst case examples, as delusions of people who haven't yet seen the truth or truth of the matter. Folks ought to hear the echoes of religious fervor therein. Similarly, philosophical and feministic colonialism is a thing, each attempting to hold some specific view as to the proper modality of living, towards the abnegation of any and all other such views. I would, however, temper that latter point in that for both feministic and philosophical colonialism oft it is the case that there are actually a multitude of differing views on the topic, rather than any specific view that is being pushed, and importantly there are oft ethically valid dispositions within each that are being aimed at. Whereas with scientific colonialism there is no ethical disposition at all, or perhaps more to the point, the ethicity of such practices are in part what is being discussed here, e.g. what is the ethicity of being merely factually wrong. Though among the points being made in this piece, and among the facts, such as they are, regarding scientism in general, its aethical nature is exactly a part of its form. That is, facts do not in themselves carry any ethical import at all. They are aethical in their form. Again, though, this point is also in part what is under discussion in this piece. Technological colonialism is likewise plausibly ethically sound, in that it merely presents to another culture some technology it can utilize. Yet, despite its plausible ethical soundness, it is also among the most destructive to cultures. In regards to technology, and for the sake of brevity, I shall include within technology modalities of crop production, types of crops, clothing styles, as well as the various fancy machineries, computers, etc. Technological colonialism can fairly radically destroy existing cultures on all fronts. Such is among the most pertinent aspects of colonialism in the current. Technological colonialism is somewhat unquestioningly taken as a good, barely recognized as colonialism, and is pervasive throughout the globe. What could such a bandit say? I never meant to leave you, Hutton. I never meant to do the worst thing, not to you, 'cause every time I read your message, I wish I wasn't one of your exes, now I'm the fool, solo. There is an important caveat to these degrees of ethical soundness of the types of colonialism. Each becomes less plausibly ethically sound when the issue is forced rather than shared. Conversely, each becomes more plausibly ethically sound when the issue is merely shared and not forced. The former is somewhat obvious, sharing stories is, well, it's difficult to find how that wouldn't be ethically sound, though TBH finding that point of unethicalness is part of the point of this essay. But forcing someone to hear some story, or preventing them from speaking their own stories, is far less ethically sound. The latter is somewhat less obvious, though it does follow logically. The ethical dubiousness of it being that sharing doesn't necessarily entail less destructive. Consider the ethics of war, of the murderous methodologies, the least plausibly ethically sound versions of colonialism. In the case whereby one group unilaterally initiates a war, there is a considerably less ethical soundness to the action, as unethical as the practice is at all. But if there is a mutual loathing and hatred involved, whereby all parties are guilty, all parties are willing participants, the ethical unsoundness from a colonialistic perspective is somewhat lessened. Moreover, if the war is merely playful, with no body harmed, a mutual play fighting, it is less unethically sound still. Indeed, in that case, we may even call it exactly a kind of ethical soundness. Such, after all, is something of the point of the Olympic Games, and more generally, play fighting. Perhaps with some relevance in the current, such ought to be understood as being the case for the oppression Olympics too. In a quip of the poets with tongue parted partly in jest. Honey, on your knees when you look at me. I'm dressed like a fucking queen. And you're begging, please. I rule with the velvet tongue, and my dress undone. And I'll get you lost, but I'm having fun. Holy, 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 yeah. Holy, 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 holy. In the case of merely sharing stories, we may understand such as a kind of play fighting. When all parties involved are sharing stories, everyone understanding that it is play fighting, then it follows that it is more ethically sound in its expression. With those definitions and understandings of the various types of colonialism in mind, I want to draw the reader's attention again to the flattish earthers. In the current, they are a somewhat despised, maligned, and ridiculed minority cultural expression. And I mean, let's be honest, not without some reason. But the point is that the proper way of understanding flattish earthers is as a cultural expression. The proper ethical questions are, is it appropriate to colonize them? To destroy their culture? Is there something ethically wrong with their culture, or is it merely something factually wrong? Is there something ethically wrong with being factually wrong? There is a further issue, and it is a most serious philosophical issue. Is there anything factually wrong with flattish earthers? To paraphrase the poets, is this a place or not for the weary kind? To be clear, we are holding flattish earthers as a mostly uncontroversial stand-in for any culture whatsoever, and we are essentially asking the question, what are the proper ways to interact with them? A slightly more controversial perspective is it okay to commit cultural genocide against the flattish earthers? Not stabbing them to death in the physical sense, but stabbing them to death in the philosophical sense. Educating away the wrongness of their opinions, views, and their cultural expression. This has obvious and serious ethical import as regards cultural expressions in general, and I don't mean to make overly light of colonialism. I do, however, intend to take a serious look with a rather light heart on the issues surrounding colonialism. After taking into consideration the example of the flattish earthers, the piece will attempt to translate that into the realm of other cultural expressions, not in a historical context, but in the context of the current. To quote the poets, pick up your crazy heart and give it one more try. As the title of the piece suggests, this can also be understood fruitfully as a question of privilege, specifically, privileging certain kinds of claims, and ultimately privileging certain kinds of cultures, or more broadly and perhaps relevantly, certain kinds of cultural practices. If, in other words, someone determines, or a group determines, that it is morally permissible, or indeed even morally praiseworthy, to philosophically knife flattish earthers, to kill their ideas, to eradicate their cultural expression, then it will follow that there are many other kinds of cultural expressions, etc., that ought to be philosophically knifed to death. Conversely, if someone, or some group of people determine that it is not ethically permissible, or indeed, it is ethically blameworthy to philosophically knife flattish earthers, it will follow that there are no cultural practices, expressions, etc., whereby it is ethically permissible to philosophically knife them, at least, not without there being some further ethical harm associated with the cultural practices so knifed. That is, as will be expanded upon, if the mere factual wrongness of flattish earthers is sufficient a justification for a philosophical knifing, then it will follow that plausibly a lot of other sorts of cultural practices are justifiably knifed. In other words, a cultural practice of slavery, murder, etc., may well deserve to be philosophically knifed to death for ethical reasons that have to do with the acts that are being so knifed. There are ethical harms associated with slavery, murder, etc., that at least are not so obviously the case with flattish earthers, or for that matter, a host of other kinds of cultural practices. The harm of supposedly being factually or objectively wrong is partly what is under consideration here as to if such amounts to an ethically sound justification for philosophically knifing some ideas to their death. A bit more broadly and directly, the question if there is ethical badness associated with being factually incorrect, and if that ethical badness is sufficient to justify their being philosophically knifed to death. In the poetics of it, question. And why do you sing hallelujah? If it means nothing to ya? Why do you sing with me at all? Answer. It's not that we're scared. It's just that it's delicate. What does not necessarily follow if it is ethically permissible to philosophically knife flattish earthers is that it is therefore ethically permissible to philosophically knife all or any given cultural practice. Interestingly enough, if it is permissible to philosophically knife flattish earthers, the grounds upon which it is okay become highly relevant, and fairly indicative of the methodologies involved. Examining the grounds, reasoning, methodologies, etc. of ethical soundness, assuming it is ethically permissible or ethically praiseworthy to PK flattish earthers, can perhaps give some guidance as to how other kinds of cultural practices ought to be understood as being or not being pikeable. In terms of ethical considerations, there is a principle that is largely applicable. More importantly, it is a view that is broadly understood as a kind of default ethical position. Something is unethical if it is causing harm. It may, therefore, be permissible to PK an idea, a cultural expression, if it is causing harm. This, of course, leaves open the question as to what constitutes harm. Note, however, harm is not the only possible consideration with regards to ethical concerns. It is merely the most common and well-understood notion as to what may be of ethical consideration. We shall look at other sorts of ethical considerations, but firstly, harm and harm reduction. Harm reduction, harm analysis as ethical analysis. Harm analysis touches upon the primal brain for people. It holds in one form or another a kind of utilitarian view of the world, and a principle of the form do what thou wants, providing that no harm is done. The ethical analysis associated with harm reductionist views have a wide variety of issues associated with them, such that despite their intuitiveness, and indeed, despite their plausibly good gross application, nonetheless run afoul rather serious kinds of problems, dancing you to the end of love. Many are rather well-known kinds of problems, so I will merely brush by the problems to give the reader a sense of them, before attempting to address the relevant issues more systematically. 1. It is plausibly ethically good to do harm to some selective portion of people in order to do good or perhaps prevent harm to some larger portion of people. Folks in the online discourse ought to recognize this as the trolley problem, noting that this is hardly a novel take in the philosophical discourse. 1a. This particular issue is likely systemic to any utilitarian analysis. Without some further ethical considerations, a utilitarian analysis will hold to such at least seemingly obvious bads as sacrificing babies to gods in order to appease them, letting a mother die to save the baby, mass murder in order to service the greater good, etc. 1b. As one intimates, there is the possibility of having a sense of utilitarianism without being exclusively bound to it, e.g. that it is possible to hold to one or more other ethical principles, within which a gross utilitarian analysis may function. For instance, we may hold that there are fundamental rights of some sort or another that cannot be violated, even via a utilitarian analysis. We might be able to call such an all other things being equal, utilitarian ethics are sound sort of analysis. In other words, if we happen to pre-adjust the settings so the things are just, good, ethical, in the first place, then we can hold to a gross utilitarian analysis as a pragmatic methodology. Of course, that really highlights the futility, or at least the potential futility, of a gross utilitarian analysis as a means of bringing about just, good conditions in the first place. Such does, however, strongly suggest that utilitarian analysis may be practically useful for the maintenance of such a good and just society. 2. Harm reduction, doing whatever one wants, provided that no harm is done to others. Firstly, harm itself is actually vague to the point of uselessness. What kind of harm? Emotional harm? Any kind of harm at all? Physical harm? Spiritual harm? Cultural harm? Future harm? Harm to the past? There are so many possible harms that doing whatever one wants, with that particular caveat, may amount to doing nothing at all. Paralysis of form, stagnation of life, a lack of living at all for all. Perhaps worse, such may very well amount to a do whatever you want sort of understanding, for with harm being undefined, it is ultimately left to the person who is doing whatever they want to define what harm means. If there were a sufficient definition and understanding as to what constitutes harm in the first place, if we all already agreed as to what harm means, then this principle would be fine. Much like point 1b, this notion may actually be useful after the fact, that is, once harms have become well defined and understood, then the principle may be relevant. Until then, those holding to this principle are really just secretly or explicitly holding to a personal principle as to what constitutes harm, to which they adhere. Secondly, others is unclear. People? Objects? Animals? Any persons or just some? Cultures? The planet? Again, without some sense of definition to the term, we may find ourselves in a position whereby no action at all is allowable, or any subset of actions, to any subset of persons or objects, or perhaps any and all actions as being ethically permissible to any and everyone. We can try to hold to certain obvious notions, like we mean all people, or we mean all ethically relevant agents, etc., but in practice these all have similar kinds of issues associated with them. To return to the central thematic question, what harms are associated with flattish earthers, both as they are, and in terms of piking them? There is a reductive sensualist version of what constitutes harm that holds that anything that feels bad causes harm. In the case of flattish earther cultural genocide, we might say something like the following: it would be harmful to PK them, as it hurts their feelings. It destroys their culture after all. It makes them feel poorly, it may ruin their lives. Hence, there is no circumstance whereby it is ethically permissible to PK flattish earthers. There are, however, serious issues with this view. For one, it tacitly holds that there can be no cultural change whatsoever that isn't harmful. Abolish slavery? Harmful. How dare you? Stop female genital mutilation? That's my culture. How dare you harm me? Have a racist worldview? That's my culture. I want my ethnostate now. Though we may well hold that in those instances there are other reasons that justify their piking, we would still be left with issues regarding exactly trivial cultural expressions. Want to change the cultural norms of dressing and style? Too bad. Want to change the recipe for food preparations? No way. Those my traditions. Worse still, such a view tacitly holds that any personal view is untouchable. Now, there is something to holding that one's personal view ought not necessarily be challenged at any given point. Such touches upon the issues of the relevance of lived experience and emotional harm. However, such potentially defies any sense of communication whatsoever, or any sense of education whatsoever, which is contradictory in that one's personal views are most likely informed, crafted, created, etc., via exactly such things as communication and education. Let alone the pragmatic implications involved, which would amount to something like the following: it is ethically impermissible for anyone to educate anyone, and it is ethically dangerous ground to bother to communicate with anyone at all. It's possible, however, to in some way or another demarcate permissible circumstances of education and communication, and the reader ought to hear the echoes of the current discourse on this. Parents ought to be in charge of educating their children. Science is the proper educational tool. Certain philosophical discourse methodologies are the proper modalities of communication. Nonviolent communication is the proper methodology for communication, and so forth. Or conversely, free speech knows no bounds. All types of speech are permissible. Knives out and fight. There is something odd about this sort of demarcation, specifically, who is actually permitted to speak to whom, and on what subject. What is odd about it is that it explicitly privileges certain viewpoints, very often the viewpoints of those who already hold a given cultural view. How, after all, could anyone but a flattish earther know anything at all about flattish earthers? flattish earther children ought to be taught by their flattish earther parents, and so forth. Such, after all, defines how cultural expressions are passed on. There is an additional issue with this sort of position, namely, that it works all ways. That is, flattish earthers wouldn't be able to communicate or educate people either. There simply wouldn't be any kind of communication whatsoever, or communication and education would be restricted upon arbitrary grounds at any given point. By arbitrary grounds, I mean that when, where, and with whom we divide people up into groups that are valid to communicate and educate within become arbitrary. Are cultural expressions in the current valid? Or merely those with deep historical roots? Are future cultural expressions going to be valid? Where such grounds be arms, one of us will die inside these arms. In short, that kind of concern on its own at any rate is largely incoherent. The notion, that is, that it is not permissible to PK flattish earthers because by doing so one is causing harm to them, in the sense that it harms their emotional well-being. Again, such isn't to suggest that there is no harm at all entailed in such practices, rather, it is to say that the restriction on piking someone is too restrictive. Emotional harm, in other words, as a limiting factor is very likely so restrictive a norm that it would entail such things as no communication, no education of any sort, no getting rid of harmful practices in general, no cultural change at all, etc. Conversely, relevantly and pertinently, the issues surrounding emotional harm ought not be dismissed on this accounting of them. My suspicion is that folks who do dismiss emotional harms are doing so for reasons of the preceding sort. To be blunt about it all, the plausible ethically sound aspect of protecting the emotional well-being of someone's in the context of privileging and cultural genocidal tendencies is that by doing so we are exactly protecting, nurturing, and growing a given sort of life, e.g. a given sort of cultural expression. To not merely crush the delicate sorts of creatures that are cultural expressions, but also to grow them, nurture them, and protect them. Folks, gentle readers or not, may, via this sense of grasping at emotional reality, get a good, or at least better understanding of the issues at stake in this piece, in these seemingly quite silly sorts of questions. To quote the poets, it's not that we're scared, it's just that it's delicate and in the currents, many of us may be as naked as we came. The main philosophical and likely spiritual point there being that a global cultural genocidal tendency has been underway for some time via especially currently the internets, and once all that is stripped away, what remains, what regrows, what persists, etc., has a certain reality to it that is difficult to deny. The other sort of concern regarding harm is, are flattish earthers causing anyone any harm? Do they, in some sense, deserve to be piked? Or more to the point, and somewhat humorously put, totally philosophically knifed, TPK'd? This has a few aspects of it worth considering. Let's assume for the moment that they are factually wrong. Is it the case that there is something harmful about believing and acting on something that is factually wrong? Harmful to the person who believes it, or harmful to others due to them spreading the factually wrong information? Noting that, unlike, say, factually wrong bodily health information, there isn't any obvious physical harm happening to anyone who comes to believe this factually wrong thing. In other words, believing that poison is healthy and drinking it causes a kind of harm by which we would reasonably be able to hold that there is something harmful in people believing in such things. Such is not so clearly the case in regards to flattish earthers. That they are, we assume, factually wrong about it doesn't obviously entail anything like a harm being done to them, or to anyone else for that matter. We may well suppose, after all, that people living some long time ago, in some far-forgotten place, generally believed that the earth was flattish, and their belief didn't harm them. We may even look at the people in the current who are flattish earthers, and hold that their having that belief doesn't obviously harm them. They live normal lives, have friends, family, loved ones, and so forth. It may be the case that by having that factually incorrect belief that they are committing unobvious harms that may play out over the long term, throughout iteration of that belief. For instance, it is plausible to suppose that by holding to the belief flattish earthers are unable to navigate the world in a real sense. That is, if they were to try to circumnavigate the world, it would be contrary to their beliefs, and hence, they wouldn't bother to try and circumnavigate the world. Or, the manner in which they'd go about it would be ineffective. We may also well note that by holding to a flattish earther position, there are other, we suppose, factually correct interpretations of the universe as a whole that are not plausibly held. In other words, supposing that some facsimile of the current scientific lore on the form of the universe is factually correct, a flattish earther is going to have a very difficult time coming to believe such things. Hence, the harm, and it deserves scare quotes, may be that they make themselves, and potentially others, unable or less able to accept other supposed factually correct things. The scare quotes are deserved because we are tacitly supposing there is a harm in not knowing factual things about the universe, which is of course the very sort of harm we are scrutinizing in the case of flattish earthers. We are, in other words, tacitly supposing that there is harm involved in not knowing the various supposed factual claims that the science informs us about the universe as justification for why there is a supposed harm involved in believing in a flattish earth. There is, however, a kind of broad way of framing this that avoids that pitfall. Specifically, knowing these sorts of scientific factual things provides people in general with a wide variety of goods. Goods in the sense of practical, meaningful ways of interacting with the world. Knowing how to factually interface with the world in a meaningful, practical, and pragmatic manner, after all, entails a lot of other sorts of goods for the species. Hence, the point that holding to a flattish earther position can cause harm in the following way: it entails that such folks are likely to hold a wide variety of other factually wrong sorts of positions, and thereby harms them and potentially others as they spread their factually wrong claims by denying them the goods that come from factually correct dispositions. There is something to this sort of claim of harm. However, it is likely overstated. For instance, in the current many and perhaps most flattish earthers actually accept scientific reasoning, and accept a wide variety of other scientifically factual sorts of understandings. Moreover, non-flattish earthers hold many unscientific claims and supposedly factually wrong claims of a wide variety of sorts. We may perhaps hold that such is the proper kind of justification for a TPK on the flat earthers. But, and it's a big oh but, the justification is fairly weak. The sorts of harms being described, in other words, are not strongly related to holding the position of a flattish earther, or indeed, any particular supposed factually wrong position, or for that matter, any supposed factually correct position. There is a kind of case that can be made that holds that supposed factually correct positions provide people with tools of understanding that enable them to do less harmful things, more things in general, and good things, as in helpful things for other people and for themselves. But the mere holding of supposed factually wrong sorts of positions doesn't actually entail anything like the holding of other supposed factually wrong positions, nor, for that matter, does holding any supposed factually correct positions entail holding other supposed factually correct positions. Among the serious limitations of this kind of claim is the tacit or explicit supposition that science is the proper adjudicator of concern. This point will be expanded upon more later in this piece. Here note that the pragmatics involved in living are clearly not delimited or perhaps even delimitable to scientific facts. Folks can, have, and currently do live good, meaningful lives that have little whatsoever to do with anything akin to scientific lore. Again, the kind of disposition to trust the science in a sort of unquestioning manner is undergirding the claim, and it is exactly that kind of factualness as a matter of ethical concern that is under scrutiny here. Where unquestioning isn't a term that is dependent upon scientific reasoning at all. That is, it isn't the claim that science is always evolving or science is a debate, etc. It is the claim that scientific reasoning as such is not to merely be trusted implicitly, unproblematically, or unquestioningly. A duet as properly paraphrased poets: "Are you drunk enough? Magic is in the air, there ain't no science here, so come and get your everything, and at last my love has come along, and life is like a song, and here we are, in heaven." The reader ought to hear echoes of many of the classic dispositions regarding free speech, especially within academic circles, as being the methodology whereby the sussing out of the factually correct positions from the factually incorrect positions is practically obtainable. And it is worth noting and returning to this point, such does have a kind of track record of successes and failures of some kind, or at any rate, a track record that is something that can be considered and understood for its successes and failures. There is a kind of claim that runs that too great a difference between cultural expressions may entail a kind of harmfulness to their coexistence. Though, let's be clear, that such doesn't entail the lack of a right to exist of either, rather, such denotes a kind of ethically significant concern regarding the placement, juxtaposition, and intermingling of cultures with too great a differential between them. Such has at its most plausible the notion explored elsewhere in this piece, that folks living in relative isolation having the internets dropped on them would likely experience a significantly greater amount of cultural harms done to them than folks who have had various other kinds of media exposures in their life. More to the point, folks who have had various multicultural experiences in their lives. And perhaps likewise, more so than folks who have had similar kinds of technological experiences in their lives. Although admittedly the degrees of technology are somewhat more ephemeral, the degrees of multicultural living are not. Such kinds of things have a significance of measure to them, and a relevant kind of ethicity of concern that is under scrutiny here. The reader ought also have in mind that often the pragmatics of things, historically and in the current, folks make mountains of molehills. Some, perhaps many differences that folks take as being significant are in point of fact rather bland, small, boring, and insignificant. Songs and dances, for instance, cultural hubbub about mating norms, sexual behavior, gendered structures, etc. I suspect that for this kind of concern to be taken seriously, we'd have to have a better sense of what constitutes too great a difference. The example of isolated groups is perhaps the best kind of example, and is plausibly the case of most concern. But more generally we are to be dealing with the reality that folks who have hitherto been isolated are going to no longer be nearly so isolated via the internets. There may be, in other words, instances whereby as folks come online the bridge to be gapped is too far, where too far really means something like causes them damage. Here we are speaking more directly to the notion of cultural harms in the relevant sense, where cultural harm amounts to loss of cultural practices. There is a de-escalated version of this kind of concern that is expanded upon later in this piece, which looks at this from the perspective of the child and the parent. It holds, roughly, that cultures persist as a practice in the home, in the practices of raising children, and not in some further more ephemeral abstracted state. That cultural practices are norms of behavior, in other words, that are taught to kids, and when they go out into the world, they are to be meeting folks with differing norms of behavior. That's not a cultural harm, that is just a reality of differing cultures. That is, children grow up learning a culture within the home, then go out in the world interacting with differing cultures, and later come to have children of their own whom they raise within their own culture. A culture that is likely affected by their interactions with the differing cultures, but again, that is life, not cultural harm. We may go a bit further and hold that such amounts to the very mechanisms whereby anything like culture as such has any existence to it. The questions of cultural harms comes far more from how those interactions with differing cultures take place, rather than any raw measure of difference between them. However, it may very well be the case that interactions between differing cultures is more prone to causing cultural harms and harms in general due to a greater difference between the cultures. There are several points there of some serious concerns and promise as it matters to this kind of analysis. For one thing, differences is rather vague. Intuitively, we are speaking of differing views in much the same way as we are speaking of and addressing the point directly in regards to the views of the flattish earthers v. the roundish earthers. But this point remains somewhat vague even in this aspect. What, after all, constitutes a meaningfully different view? I don't really want to try and dissect that here. I merely want to point out that the claim of cultural differences is not altogether explained via saying different views. Some views may be of little consequence as differences, even if they are fervently held, and some views may be of significant consequence, even if they are merely casually held. Along the same lines of thought, the differences in views has of itself some measure of significance to the individuals holding the views. The sheer number of differences alone are not sufficient to grasp at the plausible issues associated with differences between cultures. Still, we aren't talking about nothing at all when we are speaking of differences between cultures, nor again when we are speaking of cultural harms, and harms in general as they are associated with colonialism. The mere fact that they are either not easily, or perhaps at all, reducible to a strictly quantified number of harms isn't indicative that there are no harms happening there. Generally, what is being denoted as a harm as it relates to culture is a matter of the simple loss of some cultural aspect, whereby loss of entails at least a lack of practicing of the cultural aspect, and at most a totality of forgetting of the cultural lore. Arguably, therefore, the greater the differential between cultures, the greater the potential harms associated via their interactions. I think here there is some significant intuitiveness to the point, despite its possible irreducibility to a specific quantifiable measurement of the harms. In short, what may be harmful about piking or TPKing flattish earthers isn't exactly as it relates to flattish eartherism as such, but rather in the degree of other flattish eartherisms the individual or cultural expression as a whole has. It may be ethically fine, perhaps, to PK or TPK flattish eartherism, or a particular flattish earther, and yet be ethically abhorrent to do so when the cultural differences involved are a great deal more than merely flattish eartherism. To be as clear as I can be on this point, the harms associated with cultural change may be emergent rather than merely additive, quantitatively speaking, non-linear rather than linear. In this understanding, there is quite literally no harm whatsoever associated with the piking or TPKing of flattish eartherism as such. Rather, it is only when an en masse sort of TPKing of flattish eartherism along with associated viewpoints occurs that the cultural harm accrues. This particular view dovetails well with both a fractal understanding of the ontology and a temporal understanding of truth, each of which will be expanded upon later in this piece. In the current, this has great relevance, as does this kind of discourse in general, due to the internets in particular. The degree, ways and means whereby piking and TPKing various cultural practices around the globe are occurring ought to be of some astounding import to people. To simply begin interacting on the internets is to practically invite a TPKing of one's cultural dispositions, towards something else entirely out of the keenness of human experience to date. A stripping away of a wide variety of cultural practices. There is also plausibly the case that too great a difference between cultures may entail a harm in a more visceral sense. A harm to the mental well-being of people who interact between such divergently different cultures. Folks can get a sense of this by noting how difficult, frustrating, etc. it really can be to discuss issues with folks from differing cultures. The resistance to acculturation of differing viewpoints itself being indicative of a kind of cognitive harm. Harm to the mental well-being of the people involved, not because they are wrong, but simply in virtue of the magnitude of the differences involved that have to be bridged in order for the acculturation to occur. To destroy someone's worldview entails the destruction of a great deal about the person. This point will be explored later in this piece. Here we but note in temperament of the point, to paraphrase the poets, at last, naked as we are, life is like a song. However, let's take a step back from the question and speak a bit towards what is realistically at stake. The degree by which we may identify the person, and to some extent the group of people with their ideas, is pertinent. Kill the Indian to save the man is the relevant phrase, with its horrors intact. The most horrifying proposition thereof being that the species is not strictly identifiable with its body as such. That what we intend and mean by spirit, soul, identity, etc., is more or less exactly our ideas, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, etc. Hence, when speaking of TPKing flattish earthers, we are speaking in a meaningful sense of something like killing the flattish earther to save the person. It's worth tempering that aspect some. We can say the same sort of thing, for instance, of the slaver, the child murderer, those cultural practices that cause demonstrable harm. It is less certain that to TPK those sorts of cultural practices is unjustifiable, e.g. it is more certain that to TPK those kinds of cultural practices is likely a good sort of thing to do. The justification thereof being that they cause some sort of significant harm to people. The reader ought not take the questions here overly lightly. I choose for examination the question of the flattish earther for reasons that highlight the kind of silliness involved in the whole affair. Life, in other words, is somewhat silly. Similarly, I choose such for examination because it is relatively uncontroversial, e.g. few are those who actually hold the view, and by all, or at least most, accepted evidence, it is factually false. To quote the poets, I don't know why I spend my time writing songs I can't believe, with words that tear and strain your mind. And so you see I've come to doubt all that I once held as true. I stand alone without beliefs. The only truth I know is you. Most people can get behind the notion that the earth isn't flattish. So most people, perhaps even the overwhelming majority of people, can easily get behind the notion that to TPK flattish earthers is a perfectly fine sort of thing to do. Flattish earthers are wrong, they are clearly wrong. Do we kill them to save them then? When we speak of harms, we are very often speaking of bodily harms, but here we are pointing to other sorts of harms, harder questions, more difficult kinds of conversations. To what extent, after all, is the flattish earther a person in virtue not of their body, but in virtue of their ideas, their souls, their thoughts? Such may be a different sort of harm, it may be a more serious kind of harm. It also may not be such a serious thing. There is a meaningful sense, after all, that to change one's mind is not a bad thing, and to change one's mind is what else but to kill off some part of one's thoughts, ideas, soul, spirit, and so forth. The pragmatics of changing one's mind, we may reasonably suppose, having a lot more to do with such things as education, experience, etc., all of which involve communication of some sort, and hence are not done in isolation, at least, not generally speaking. Thus it would be improper to hold that changing one's mind is somehow more ethically relevant than having someone else work to change your mind. In other words, it isn't at least generally the case that folks could hold to the claim that the only proper or ethical way to change one's mind is through the self. This point has a bit more relevance than the mereness of the cult of the self, the individualist who is certain that they have some kind of thoughts, opinions, etc., entirely of their own devising. It points rather directly to the issues surrounding colonialism, intercultural interactions in general, the relevance of the outsider to a given cultural expression, and indeed, the relevance of the insider-outsider, those who were the outsider, or the insider, and became the other, as a means exactly of individual and cultures in general to change their minds about something. Consider the case of Santa Claus, a pretty little lie we teach our children. It brings them happiness, joy, fulfillment, brings families together, and so on. A little fiction that lives in the little ones' heads, a fiction that dies off, oft at the hands of another. It's kinda sad when it happens, but we might be hard-pressed to hold that the loss of the idea was somehow seriously harmful to the child. At the same time, we might reasonably hold that killing off the cultural aspect of Santa Claus in total causes a kind of harm, specifically in that it kills off the very notion of Santa Claus in total, e.g. TPK'd, a kind of cultural genocide. Note the relevance of scalar differences involved. In the individual there may be no harm at all involved. In the broader scalar cultural practice, there may actually be a kind of harm involved. The idea, thoughts, traditions, and so forth of Santa Claus are not, after all, living and dying within any given person, but rather a sort of shared cultural experience. Such may say something to the soul of a people, the spirit of people, the nature and form of ideas. But that is not the principal aim of this piece. It may be something relevant that crops up again, but the point ATM is to really assess the sorts of harms that may or may not arise from piking or TPKing flattish earthers, and by extension, the sorts of justifications, or lack thereof, that may be applicable to other sorts of cultural practices, ideas, thoughts, etc. To the point of more relevance and controversy consider, most people believe that racism bad, sexism bad, bigotry bad. Insofar as that is the case, such has occurred, in essence, through cultural genocide, TPKing the notions of racism, sexism, and bigotry. And yet, there is something more controversial at stake therein. While most folks agree that racism bad, sexism bad, bigotry bad, there remain differences in opinion as to what constitutes these things, their varying degree of seriousness, the ramifications and pragmatics of TPKing them, etc. Hence they remain controversial in the pragmatics, even though most people tend to agree and would be willing to TPK those sorts of things. Among some of the more controversial aspects thereof are such things as: do we maintain literal skin color? That is there actual value in maintaining the races in terms of their bodily form? This concern is rather wildly overblown, of course, as in the current mixed races are pretty rare on the global scalar. The races are mostly segregated, and not under threat. Indeed, mixing races is so new that it remains somewhat controversial among communities, and insofar as that is the case, they are clearly expressing racism. Do we PK them? Maybe. Do we TPK them? Maybe not. Though there is no threat to the races in the current, it is not unjustifiable to hold that there is some value in maintaining their distinctiveness. Perhaps the most pertinent example of this are certain indigenous populations, whose actual race are effectively endangered. There is a reasonable case to be made that mixing races for them may amount to something like a meaningful loss and hence a meaningful harm. But such is not generally the case for most races. And to be clear, by race, I pretty much mean skin color, and by value, I mean such petty little things as variations on the bodily form, the beauties involved in skin tone, etc. Such ought not be mistaken for concern about cultural practices of a given race. This point is pertinent to note especially in the case of certain indigenous populations, whose numbers are racistly defined via blood quotas. Hence, while there may be some good associated with the maintaining of the literal skin tones, to demarcate a grouping predicated upon the skin tonality rather than their cultural upbringing is itself a highly ethically dubious sort of thing. Conversely, mixed races produce novel skin colors, bodily features, and so forth, thereby adding to rather than detracting from the variety of skin colors and bodily features. This, we may say, is a morally praiseworthy kind of thing for the same kinds of reasons that the actual loss of a race would be a morally blameworthy sort of thing. The additions of variety and beauty, in their literal skin color and bodily features, is itself something that is sufficiently good to be considered morally praiseworthy. We could get into other more controversial aspects as to how this kind of human behavior surrounding races, beauties, etc., is formative of racism, but such is perhaps a bit beyond the scope of this piece. Again, the point is to remind the reader as to the kinds of things that are actually at stake, beyond the issues of flattish eartherism. Sexism is a far fuzzier sort of thing. Gender norms are socio-cultural constructs with their own beauty, features, and variety of aspects to them. Gender norms are not, in other words, necessarily a bad sort of thing. This despite the fact that they are socio-cultural constructs. Doesn't really matter if there is a biological component to them or not. In some meaningful sense, we may well hold that gender norms amount to such things as what clothing one wears, how one wears it, when one wears it, various mating and sexual rituals, various friendship and loves rituals, and so forth. There is a perspective that holds that because they are socio-cultural constructs, that therefore they are bad, useless, that they have an ought to them that amounts to a TPK on them. Such a position is generally held by individualists and those who value personal freedom, or when given specificity, such positions are oft held by culturalists, those who strongly identify with a given cultural expression towards the derision and exclusion of other cultural expressions. Again, though, such amounts to a cultural genocidal tendency. And yet, it is not necessarily a terrible thing. Ultimately, after all, we are speaking of some cloth. What harm exactly is involved, in other words, is rather strikingly unclear. Do we wear this or that piece of clothing? How seriously do we want to take such things as a species? What dangers may accrue to their seriousness, and what harms may accrue from taking them overly lightly? But, much like the emotional harms and cultural realities, we may reasonably suppose that the sort of harms that may occur is the eradication of a delicate sort of creature, the thoughts, ideas, soul, spirit of a person and indeed of a people. In one sense quite trivial, in another sense, quite profound. Likely worth noting on that point that it isn't as if through the eradication of these gendered norms we are thereby enabled to do something else. That is, in essence, we still put on clothes, we still eat foods, we still have mating rituals, loves rituals, norms of behavior. If not in the immediate, at least in the longer term as habit. In the current, for instance, where freedom of choice in clothing is a norm, in all pragmatics people still are beholden to whatever the fashionistas so happen to be producing and promoting. There is a striking sense, in other words, where the freedom these folks are touting is anything but. Such concerns touch upon deeper sorts of philosophical questions. They also are not irrelevant to the point of this piece. However, here we are trying to draw the reader's attention to some of the broader cultural issues in the current, as to how they relate to flattish earthers. If it is permissible to TPK flattish earthers, it is at least plausibly permissible to TPK such things as racism, sexism, bigotry, etc. But the questions therein are far more delicate and subtle than folks in the current are really giving them credit. The sort of real cultural genocidal tendencies involved ought not be ignored. It's perhaps important to give some clarification as to what the philosophical knifing may actually entail. Such things as education, argumentation, discussion, books, learning, these sorts of things are the tools of the philosophical knifing. In the case of flattish earthers, to be rather blunt about it, to philosophically knife them is to educate people that the world is roundish. It may include other sorts of things, but in the broadest of strokes that is what is being discussed. To not philosophically knife them is to either not educate anyone at all about roundish eartherism, and by extension about much of anything at all, or it is to give flattish earthers thought space within the educational systems in place. To give proportional representation to flattish earthers. Readers ought to hear the relevant echoes regarding such debates as teaching creationism within the public school systems, and a wide variety of issues surrounding differentiations between educational operati, e.g. public schools, private schools, the internets, and homeschooling being the big four in play. Demarcating which subjects are taught in which particular educational operati largely misses the point of this piece. However, such does highlight the question in a meaningful sense as to if it is permissible to PK some idea, and that by demarcating the educational operati, one is inherently attempting to TPK the ideas of someone else. To have a private school that exclusively teaches flattish eartherism is to have a school that explicitly tries to TPK roundish eartherism. Still, again, it is worth the reader keeping in mind what the pragmatic concerns and plausible applications are, e.g. the reality of education as a public and private matter is a fair amount of what constitutes a TPK. It is also, importantly, what constitutes a saving, a maintaining of a given idea, cultural expression, etc. Philosophy isn't all about that TPKing, at least not all the time. I want to touch upon a few more key points before again returning to the central question of TPKing flattish earthers. Unicorn culture. A culture that believes that there are flesh and blood unicorns in the woods, protecting the forests, with magical powers, and so forth. What harm and what good may come of such things? The subtle, delicate creature that is the unicorn as an idea, the cultural expressions that form from it may very well not be bad. How such a fantastical creature interfaces with the world is very much akin to the pertinent questions here. To what extent is TPKing unicorn culture a real harm? We may well hold that such is like Santa Claus, a fictive creature, a story we may tell children, with no more nor less life than a unicorn. A sort of spirit that presents itself as something to do with one's life, that provides meaning, and indeed, is a meaningful part of one's life. It's worth noting that such stories, such conceptual creatures as unicorns, may have had little more to them than Santa Claus in the cultures that believe them. Stories that instill certain normative moral codes, whose life is epistemic in form. To PK or TPK a unicorn culture may not actually result from the disproving of the thesis that flesh and blood unicorns exist. Much as is the case with Santa Claus, proving that the flesh and blood Santa Claus doesn't exist, doesn't thereby negate the epistemic, conceptual life of Santa Claus. The spirit of Christmas continues regardless of its lacking of a flesh and blood counterpart. Likewise, unicorn culture, the spirits of the forests that guard and protect it persist regardless of there not being anything like a flesh and blood unicorn. Crushing the spirit of the unicorn is not a matter of slaying some ontologically relevant body. Ultimately, it is a matter of crushing the words that surround the spirit of the unicorn, or, for that matter, the spirit of Christmas. The concepts, the practices, the cultural actions, the various rituals involved, the styles of dress associated with it, the belief in some sense, the thoughts of it, the ideas of it. These sorts of very ephemeral kinds of things. Such is the kind of thing we are speaking of when we are speaking of piking and TPKing flattish earthers. It's something of an open question as to the degree of success that is plausible in such exercises. To what degree, in other words, are these spirits indelible parts of human life? To hold, for instance, that there are only so many ways by which a human can interact with and interpret a given aspect of the world is to hold that there are some sets of ideas which may take on differing forms of expression, but nonetheless point towards the same thing. Consider such in terms of linguistic expressions. There may be a plethora of words that describe a given ontologically relevant object. Those words may have variations in their meaning, in their epistemic forms, yet ultimately they are conveying meaning, content, etc., about the same ontologically relevant object. If we were to destroy some linguistic expression in favor of some other linguistic expression, we are still holding to the same kind of spirit of meaning involved. A rose by any other name. If, as we suppose, the unicorn concept denotes a spirit of protecting the forests, simply changing the linguistic expression to concern about the environment doesn't thereby really alter the meaning, the spirit of the expression. Moreover, in terms of how humans may interact with such ontological entities as the forest entails among them the notion of protecting the forests. Even if, in other words, we were to TPK the spirit of the unicorn, the spirit of protecting the forests. Among the aspects of human life that would nevertheless arise is the spirit of exactly the unicorn cultural disposition to protect the forests. As a concept, as an epistemic form, whose ontology is primarily located within the realm of ideas, thoughts, spirit, soul, etc., it is plausibly the case that a TPK doesn't meaningfully harm the spirit. For such sorts of entities, in other words, death has little or perhaps no meaningful import to them. Such a supposition holds that there are meaningful limits to how the human species can interact with the ontology at all, which isn't necessarily the case. But such is not a particularly odd supposition to hold either. In terms of the flattish earthers, to TPK them may not really entail a loss of that modality of understanding the world. It may be the case that such a modality is indelibly attached to the epistemic ontology of human beings. For instance, it may be the case that such is a kind of phase that people go through in life, whereby their epistemic dispositions are inclined to understand the ontology of the earth as flattish, for the rather obvious reason that it looks flattish. It defaults to flattish earther unless the species makes efforts to hold and teach that the world is roundish. To TPK flattish earthers may ultimately entail something very much akin to TPKing Santa Claus, something that happens all the time, where children grow to learn the merely epistemic nature of Santa Claus, and hence no longer believe in Santa Claus, yet teach their kids the supposed reality of Santa Claus. Children still initially experience the world as flattish, and indeed, more than that, the species experiences the world as flattish regardless of their epistemically derived understanding that the world is roundish. The human species does not act as if the world were roundish, for the simple reason that it isn't how the human species experiences the world, really in any way save for through an epistemically derived understanding that the world is roundish, and the capacity to actually circumnavigate the world, along with a few technological wonders like space travel. The species may understand it, may deeply believe it, and yet the experiential reality of their lives, how they actually interact with the world, the phenomenological reality of it, is as if it were flattish. It is unclear, therefore, if TPKing flattish earthers is really a plausible sort of thing to do in the sense of actual cultural genocide. But, perhaps more importantly, even if the species does TPK flattish earthers, the harm involved may not be that great. Consider again the modalities of colonialism. The introduction of new technology. When a culture is introduced to some new technology, such that it alters the way by which they are interacting with the ontology, their cultural practices are disrupted. To utilize beasts of burden to farm, or to utilize machinery to farm, each entails fairly radically different modalities of life for the species, both from each other and from farming without either. Such amounts to a kind of cultural genocide. Insofar as the technology is available, people may choose to utilize it, but by making that choice, insofar as people make that choice, the cultural genocide happens. Likewise, the introduction of differing crops, food sources, clothing options, etc., all entail the destruction of pre-existing cultural expressions. A kind of cultural genocide, in the most serious of manners. Cloaking these aspects by holding that they are necessarily good or better belies the reality of what actually happens. Such is colonialism, such is cultural genocide. The real question, as terrifying as it may be, is to what extent are those the kinds of things the species may actually want, need, or desire? A bit more broadly, the introduction of books, reading, learning in that manner, the selection of books, the availability of them, historically amounts to cultural genocide. In the current, the relevant technological development of note is the Internet. Insofar as this is introduced to a society, the kinds of information, modalities of living, the kinds of ideas, thoughts, the way the spirits move through the species, the transference of ideas, knowledge, and so forth is incredibly destructive to any pre-existing culture. It is, in essence, a global cultural genocide.
What'd you say?